The colony of Calum IV was not a military base. It was not a weapons depot or a strategic outpost. It was a farming world, a quiet green planet where 40,000 people grew food, raised children, and lived simple lives far from the noise of galactic politics. The people there knew the stars above them were full of other civilizations, some friendly and some not. But they had always trusted that the rules of the interstellar concord would keep them safe. They were wrong. On a Tuesday morning, without warning, without any declaration of war, and without any reason other than a desire to send a message, the Vrathi Dominion burned Calum IV from orbit. 7 warships appeared above the planet and opened fire on the surface for 6 straight hours. They targeted towns. They targeted fields. They targeted the emergency shelters where people ran when the first explosions began. The Vrathi recorded the whole thing. They edited it into a clean, precise video and transmitted it to every member state of the interstellar concord before the smoke had even finished rising. The message attached to the video was short. It said that the concord's rules meant nothing to the Vrathi Dominion. It said that any species that believed otherwise was welcome to test them. It said, in the cold language of an empire that had never been truly challenged, that this was simply the natural order of things. 40,000 people were dead by the time the video finished playing in the Concord chambers. The chamber was silent for a long time after the footage ended. Representatives from dozens of species sat in their seats and said nothing. Some of them looked down at their tables. Some of them looked at the human delegation. A few of them quietly began composing statements of condolence. Elena Vasquez sat at the human table and did not move. She was a small woman with gray hair and tired eyes, and she had been humanity's ambassador to the Concord for 11 years. She had spent those 11 years in that chamber, arguing, negotiating, warning, and compromising. She had watched the Vrathi push the edges of Concord law for years. She had stood at that same podium more times than she could count and delivered the same careful, measured words. She stood up now. The room watched her. She walked to the podium slowly, and when she reached it, she stood there for a moment, without speaking. Then she looked out at the chamber at the hundreds of alien faces watching her, and she spoke in a voice that was completely calm. For 11 years, she said, I have stood here and told this body that there are certain things humanity will not accept. Not as a policy, not as a political position, as a fact. She paused. We told the Vrathi Dominion this directly, more than once. We told them through diplomatic channels. We told them in open session. We told them privately. We used every language they speak. We were clear. She looked down at the table in front of her. Then she looked back up. 40,000 people lived on Calum IV. They grew food. They had families. They had names. She stopped again. Her jaw tightened for just a moment. The Vrathi knew this. They chose to do what they did anyway. They chose to film it. They chose to send it here. No one in the chamber made a sound. I will not be bringing a motion to this body, she said. I will not be requesting a committee review or a sanctions proposal or a diplomatic inquiry. Those things were for before today. She reached into her jacket, removed her ambassador's credentials, a small silver card that every Concord representative carried, and placed it on the podium. I am resigning my ambassadorship, effective immediately. My government will be in contact. She walked away from the podium. She walked through the chamber doors. She did not look back. For a moment, nobody moved. The Thalassian ambassador, a tall, gray-skinned creature who had been in the Concord longer than any other serving representative, leaned toward his aide and said quietly, What does that mean? What will they do? His aide, who had studied humans for 30 years as a profession, took a moment before answering. I don't know exactly, he said, but I think we should pay attention. Back on Earth, the response did not look like panic. It did not look like grief, at least not from the outside. What it looked like, to any observer who happened to be watching, was a machine quietly powering on. The Unified Defense Command had not been placed on full war footing in over 180 years. Most people alive had never seen it happen. But within 6 hours of Elena Vasquez walking out of the Concord chamber, it happened. It did not happen with speeches or ceremonies. There were no broadcasts to the public, No dramatic announcements. Orders moved through chains of command that most civilians didn't know existed. Lights came on in buildings that were officially listed as storage facilities. Ships that had been sitting in deep space depots with their engines cold began their warm-up cycles. Officers who had been on extended leave received short messages on personal devices and began packing bags. A Thalassian intelligence analyst, watching the data feeds from human space, noticed the changes within the first 12 hours. She filed a report to her government, marked urgent. Her government forwarded it to the Concord. The Concord sent a diplomatic message to Earth's government, asking for clarification on what was happening. The response from Earth's government came back in less than an hour. It was 3 sentences long. It said that Earth appreciated the Concord's concern. It said that Earth's internal military activities were sovereign matters. It said that the Concord would be informed of any relevant developments in due course. The Thalassian analyst read the response and then sat very still at her desk for a while. In 30 years of studying humans, she had learned to read what they didn't say as carefully as what they did. What they hadn't said was, "Don't worry." What they hadn't said was, "We are not planning anything." What they hadn't said was, "We will work through the proper channels." She pulled up the historical files on human warfare. She had read them before, years ago, as part of her training. She read them again now. She read about a species that, when pushed to a certain point, did not escalate gradually. She read about a species that, when it decided something needed to be done, did not do it halfway. She read the words of human military historians and philosophers and commanders across centuries, all of them saying the same thing in different ways. There is a threshold, the files said. You will know it when you cross it. You will know it because after you cross it, they will not stop. She closed the files. She looked at the data feeds from human space. More ships warming up. More logistics networks activating. More quiet, efficient, purposeful movement. She picked up her communication device and called her superior. "I think," she said, when he answered, "that the Vrathi have made a very serious mistake." Admiral Cale Doran had not slept in 31 hours when he stepped onto the bridge of the UEFS Ironhold and looked at the fleet assembled around him. He was not a man given to dramatic thoughts. He had spent 40 years in the Defense Command, and in those 40 years he had learned to see things plainly, not because he lacked feeling, but because clarity was a professional requirement. When things became emotional, you made mistakes. So he stood on the bridge and looked out at the ships and saw them plainly, without drama. There were 412 of them in this formation alone. They were not all warships. Some were logistics vessels, fuel carriers, and mobile repair platforms. But they were all armed, all crewed, and all pointed in the same direction. And this was only one of 3 fleets assembling at different coordinates across human space. A young officer appeared at his shoulder. "Admiral, Concord diplomatic channel is open again. The Thalassian ambassador is requesting a conversation. Tell him I'll speak with him after we're underway," Doran said. "Yes, sir. He says it's urgent." "Everything is urgent to diplomats," Doran said, without looking away from the view outside. "It's underway, or it's nothing." In the Concord chamber, the mood was unlike anything most of the representatives had seen in their careers. There was not panic exactly, but there was something close to it, a kind of anxious confusion that came from watching something happen and not fully understanding what you were watching. The Vrathi ambassador, a broad-shouldered creature named Drevak, sat in his seat with his arms crossed and an expression that mixed contempt with something he would not have admitted was unease. He had been in diplomatic service for 30 years. He had watched species posture and threaten and bluster. He had watched them send ships toward each other, and then pull back at the last moment when someone blinked. That was how these things worked. Everyone knew that. The human buildup was different. It had now been 8 days since Calum IV, and in those 8 days the humans had not sent any messages to the Vrathi government. They had not filed any legal motions with the Concord. They had not held any press conferences. They had not done any of the things that species did when they wanted to signal anger while actually buying time to find a way to avoid a fight. They had just been building the ships, the logistics networks, the supply chains activating across human space, the Defense Command pulling in personnel from assignments all across the Concorde's territory. It was quiet, and it was fast, and it had a quality to it that Drevik found, if he was honest with himself, unsettling. There was no noise to it, no chest beating, no signals meant to be intercepted and analyzed for weakness or hesitation. Just preparation, moving forward, at a steady pace, like a tide coming in. He leaned over to his aide. "They're performing," he said. "It's a show of force. They want us to come to the table." His aide, a younger Vrathi who had actually read more than Drevik had about human behavior, nodded carefully. "Perhaps, Ambassador. Though I should note, they have not requested a table." Drevik brushed this off. "They will." What the Concorde did not know, and would not know until later, was that the human buildup was not improvised. The ships that were now converging on the border of Vrathi space had not been built in 8 days. The logistics nodes that had activated near Vrathi territory had not been constructed in 8 days. The supply caches, the fuel depots, the communication relay points, the pre-positioned repair drones, none of it was new. It had all been there for years. The Defense Command had a planning division that did nothing but prepare for scenarios that the rest of the government hoped would never happen. For 20 years, one of those scenarios had been a full military response against the Vrathi Dominion. It had been updated annually. It had been tested in simulations. It had been revised as the Vrathi grew more aggressive, and revised again as their technology changed. And when Elena Vasquez placed her credentials on that podium and walked out, the division's current version of the plan was already 22 years in the making. Humans were patient creatures when patience was called for. But they were also, underneath that patience, always prepared. They had not stayed safe for 180 years by trusting that peace would take care of itself. The Thalassian analyst who had been watching human space filed another report. This one noted that several large human merchant vessels operating near Vrathi space had, in the past week, stopped broadcasting commercial cargo manifests. She had cross-referenced their hull designs against old Defense Command specifications, and found that the hulls were modular, built to operate as cargo vessels, in peacetime, and to accept weapons and armor modules in a matter of days. She had counted, so far, 61 such vessels. She wrote in her report, "These are not merchant ships. They have never only been merchant ships." Her government read the report and immediately requested an emergency session with the Human Foreign Ministry. The meeting was polite and brief. The Human Foreign Minister confirmed nothing and denied nothing. She offered tea. She asked after the health of the Thalassian ambassador's family. She expressed warm feelings about the long friendship between the two species. When the Thalassian diplomat returned and was asked what she had learned, she said that they are not going to tell us anything and that they don't need our permission. On the 10th day, the Vrathi government sent an envoy to the Human Defense Command. He was a senior diplomat named Kareth, chosen because he was calm under pressure and had experience dealing with what the Vrathi internally called reactive species, meaning those who occasionally needed to be talked down from emotional overreactions to military incidents. He arrived at the human station near the border with a staff of 6 and an attitude of controlled authority. He was received politely. He was given a comfortable room. He was offered food and water. And after a short wait, he was brought into a meeting room where a single human officer sat across the table from him. Kareth made his speech. He spoke about the importance of measured response. He spoke about the risks of escalation. He used the word dialogue several times, and the word proportional even more. He offered, on behalf of the Vrathi Dominion, to discuss the incident at Calum IV through the proper Concorde channels. The human officer listened without speaking. When Kareth finished, the officer reached across the table and placed a small data chip in front of him. "What is this?" Kareth asked. "A projection," the officer said. "Vrathi fleet losses, modeled over the next 90 days. The accuracy on these models runs around 94%. He paused. "You should take it home and show your military advisors." Kareth looked at the chip. Then he looked at the officer. "Is that all?" "That's all," the officer said. Kareth took the chip. He returned to Vrathi space. He showed the projection to the high command. The room was quiet for a long time. The numbers were very specific. They were not round numbers meant to frighten. They were detailed by ship class, by engagement point, by time of loss. They read like a document written by someone who had already decided how the war would go and was simply informing the other side. The High Command Senior General set the data chip down and looked around the room. "They're bluffing," said one of the commanders. No one else spoke. Fleet Lord Tesseric had fought 11 wars. He had fought border skirmishes against the Pelhari and won. He had crushed the Dunnic Collective's rebellion in 3 months. He had broken 2 separate species into client states through a combination of precision strikes and starvation blockades. He was not considered a cruel commander by Vrathi standards. He was considered efficient. He did what was needed. He won. That was the measure of a commander in the Dominion. He had studied the humans before the war began, because he studied every enemy before engaging them. He had read intelligence reports. He had watched footage of their military exercises. He had reviewed the data chip that the envoy Kareth had brought back, and unlike some of his colleagues, he had not dismissed it as a bluff. He had taken it seriously. He had adjusted his defensive formations. He had positioned his best ships at the points the human projection identified as primary attack vectors. He had felt prepared. He had been wrong. The first wave of human ships crossed into Vrathi space on a Thursday. They did not announce themselves. There was no declaration of war transmitted, not because the humans didn't know how to observe that formality, but because they had, weeks earlier, sent a single formal document to the Vrathi government, stating that the attack on Calum IV was itself an act of war, that humanity's response would follow, and that no further notice would be given. The Vrathi government had filed this document under hostile rhetoric. They had not taken it seriously. The first wave hit Tesseric's forward positions hard. He responded as trained, pulling his flanking ships in to cut off the human advance. The projection on the data chip had predicted this exact engagement point, and he had doubled the defense there. For the first several hours, he felt like he was holding. Then, the second wave came from a completely different direction. And while his forces were adjusting to that, a third strike hit the shipyard at Vreth Station not from space, but from a team of human soldiers who had been moving through the asteroid field near the station for 2 weeks in low-powered vessels designed to look like debris. They had been patient and quiet and invisible, and now they were inside the station. The shipyard was destroyed in 4 hours. Tesseric stared at his tactical display and understood, for the first time, the difference between an opponent who was reacting to him and an opponent who had been thinking about this longer than he had. The war did not go quickly, but it went steadily, and it always went in one direction. Human forces did not fight the way the Vrathi fought. The Vrathi style was aggressive, direct, and focused on breaking the enemy's will through overwhelming visible force. You hit hard. You made it clear that resistance was too costly. Your enemy made a calculation and surrendered. That was war. The humans were doing something different. They were not trying to break the Vrathi's will. They were trying to remove the Vrathi's ability. There was a difference, and Tesseric came to understand it slowly and painfully over the weeks that followed. Every human strike targeted something functional: shipyards, fuel processing stations, weapons manufacturing facilities, communication arrays, supply lines. The humans mapped the Vrathi war machine as if they had studied it for years, which, Tesseric would eventually learn, they had, and they went through it piece by piece. They were not performing. They were not making a point. They were simply, methodically, taking apart everything that allowed the Dominion to fight. And when the Vrathi responded, and pushed back, and caused human casualties, the humans did not slow down. This was the part Tesseric came back to again and again in his mind. In the quiet hours on his command ship, when the battle reports were in, and the numbers were what the numbers were. They did not slow down. Every species he had ever fought had a point where the losses became too heavy, and the emotional weight of the dead began to show in command decisions. Hesitation, caution, a pulling back. He waited for that point in the humans. He watched for it. He planned around it, building defensive positions designed to maximize human casualties at key points, betting that grief and fatigue would eventually do what his ships could not. It never came. They brought a prisoner to him on the 44th day of the war. He was a human marine, one of the soldiers from a ground team that had been captured during the fighting near the Dominion's Eastern Communications Hub. He was injured, his left arm in a temporary seal, but he was conscious and alert. He was young, with dark eyes, and a face that showed no particular fear. Tesseric had him brought to his personal quarters, not the interrogation room. He offered water. The human accepted it. Tesseric sat across from him for a moment before speaking. He spoke in Concord Standard, which they both knew. "I want to ask you something honestly," Tesseric said. "Not as an interrogation, as a question I genuinely want to understand." The Marine looked at him. "Ask. You've lost thousands of soldiers in this war," Tesseric said. "Your side has taken casualties I would consider significant, and the conflict is still ongoing. The original incident Calum IV is already weeks in the past. From a military standpoint, you have made your response clear." He paused. "Why do you keep fighting? What are you still trying to achieve that you haven't already achieved?" The Marine was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the cup of water in his hand. Then he looked back up. "You think we're fighting to win," the Marine said. "Aren't you?" "Winning's a side effect," the Marine said. "We're fighting for Calum IV, for the 40,000 people whose names we know. That's not done until it's done." Tesseric looked at him for a long time. "And when is it done?" "When you understand what you took from us," the Marine said quietly. "Not just that you took it. What it was." Tesseric did not have a response for that. He sat with it after the Marine was taken back. He sat with it for a long time, and in the quiet of his quarters, something he had always treated as a professional certainty that everyone had a breaking point, that everyone calculated costs and benefits, and eventually chose survival over principle, began, for the first time, to feel uncertain. Back in the Concord, the other species watched in near silence. The Thalassian analyst published an internal briefing that circulated quietly through several governments. It said plainly that the Concord had collectively misread humanity for 2 centuries. It said that humanity's patience and willingness to compromise had been mistaken for a fundamental preference for peace over conflict, when in fact, it had always been a choice that remained available only as long as certain things were not touched. It said that the Vrathi had found those things, and touched them anyway. A junior Concord diplomat from a small species called the Merith read the briefing and sent a private message to his superior. It said, "We should go through our own records. Every time we treated a human complaint as minor. Every time we assumed they would let something go. I want to know how many lines we are near." His superior read the message. Then he went through the records. He did not sleep well that night. The surrender came on a gray morning, by the human calendar, 91 days after the first ships crossed into Vrathi space. It did not come loudly. There was no dramatic final battle, no last stand, no moment where the Vrathi fleet gathered itself for one heroic charge. The end came the way the whole war had gone, quietly and completely, with the humans simply continuing to do what they had been doing until the Vrathi had nothing left to do it with. 40% of their fleet was gone. 6 of their 11 major shipyards were destroyed or severely damaged. 3 of their key fuel production systems were offline. The communication network that connected the outer dominion to the core had been reduced to fragments that couldn't agree with each other. Fleet Lord Tesseric filed the formal surrender document from what remained of his command ship. He transmitted it to Admiral Doran's flagship personally. He had insisted on doing it himself. His staff had offered to handle it, to spare him the weight of it. But he had said no. He had led the Dominion's forces. He would carry the end of it. Doran received the transmission and acknowledged it with 3 words. "Received. Stand down." That was it. No celebration on the bridge. No cheering. The crew of the Ironhold went about their work in near silence. Doran stood at the viewport and looked out at the stars for a while, and then he went to his quarters and wrote a list of names, the names of every ship and crew lost in the campaign, and he sat with it for an hour before he allowed himself to think about what came next. The Concord convened within days of the surrender, expecting the humans to arrive with demands. This was standard procedure after a war. The winner came in, listed what they wanted, and the process of negotiating terms began. Territory was the most common-esque. Resources were common too. Sometimes reparations, sometimes trade agreements rewritten to favor the victor. The chamber filled with representatives who had all privately been talking to each other about what they thought humanity would take, how much Vrathi space would change hands, which resource systems would shift to human control. Elena Vasquez walked into the chamber. The room went still. She had been a private citizen for 3 months, since the day she placed her credentials on the podium and walked out. She was not the ambassador anymore. She was here as a civilian representative of the human government, asked to deliver their terms personally, and her presence made it clear that those terms were going to be something different. She did not make a speech. She read 3 items from a document, simply and directly. The first, the Vrathi Dominion would deliver to human custody every officer, commander, and official who had given, approved, or executed the order to attack Calum IV. Not the soldiers who had fired the weapons, the people who had made the decision. They would be tried under human law. The process would be public. The second, the Vrathi Dominion would construct, using their own labor and materials, a permanent monument on the surface of Calum IV. It would list by name every person who had died in the attack. It would be built to last no less than 1,000 years. It would be accessible to anyone who wished to visit it. The third, the Vrathi Dominion would transmit, in every language they used officially, to every archive and record system in the Concord, a formal statement. The statement would say that the Vrathi Dominion had crossed a line that should not have been crossed, that the action against Calum IV was wrong, and that the Dominion acknowledged this fully and permanently. 3 things: no territory, no resources, no reparations. The chamber was very quiet when she finished reading. The Thalassian ambassador leaned toward his aide and said, barely above a whisper, "They don't want land?" His aide said nothing for a moment. Then, "They want something harder to give." The Vrathi High Command received the terms and did not react well. There were voices in the room that called it humiliation. There were voices that said a proud empire could not be made to confess in public, could not hand over its own officers to foreign courts, could not build monuments to those that it had killed. There were voices that spoke about honor and about what the Dominion's history demanded of them. Tesseric listened to all of it. He sat at the far end of the table and said nothing for a long time. When the voices quieted, he spoke. "I have spent 3 months fighting humans," he said. "And the thing I learned that none of our planning ever told me is this: they do not get tired of it. We did. They didn't." He looked around the room. "If we refuse these terms, they will continue. Not because they need to, not because it gains them anything tactically. They will continue because they feel they have to. Because to them, this is not about strategy. It is about something else entirely, something I don't have a Vrathi word for." He paused. "We can call this humiliation. We can tell ourselves we are being made to suffer unfairly. But the alternative is that we find out what they do next. And I will tell you honestly, I don't want to find out." The room was quiet. "We comply," Tesseric said. "And we mean it when we do." The trials lasted 8 months. They were held in a neutral station near the border, with observers from a dozen Concord species. The officers who had planned and approved the Calum IV attack were brought before human judges. Each was given full representation and the right to speak. Each trial was recorded and broadcast throughout the Concord. Every day of testimony was public. The sentences varied. Some were long, a few were short. What mattered to the humans, it became clear, was not the severity of the punishment as much as the completeness of the process, that each person was named, that their role was stated plainly, that no one who had made that decision was allowed to simply disappear into history without being seen. The monument took 14 months to build. It was made of dark stone imported from Vrathi territory, and it stood on the scorched plain where the largest town on Calum IV had once been. The names were carved in full, all 40,000 of them, in rows that stretched the length of the structure, each name the same size as every other name. No name was made smaller or larger by status or age. A child's name sat beside an elder's name, a farmer's name beside a teacher's name. On the day it was unveiled, Elena Vasquez was there, She had traveled from Earth at her own expense, as a private citizen. She wore plain clothes. She stood at the edge of the stone and read the names. She did not read all of them aloud. There were too many for that, but she moved along the rows slowly, her eyes going to each one, and the people who were there with her gave her the time and space to do it. She stood there for nearly 2 hours. When she was done, she turned and walked back to the transport that would take her home. A journalist asked her, as she passed, what she was feeling. She stopped and thought about it for a moment. "I feel like they've been seen," she said. Finally. Then she got into the transport and left the planet, and the monument stood behind her in the still air of a world that was learning, slowly, to breathe again. 10 years passed. The galaxy did not go back to the way it was before Calum IV. It tried to, in the way that ordinary life always tries to return to ordinary rhythms after something large and permanent has happened. Trade continued. Diplomatic meetings were held. Species argued over borders and tariffs, and the same small things they had always argued over. The Concord chambers filled and emptied on schedule. Reports were written. Committees met. But underneath all of it, something had shifted. Not loudly. Not in any way you could point to in a single document or a single moment. Just a quiet, permanent change in how the galaxy thought about certain things. About lines. About patience. About what a species that had been quiet for a long time was actually capable of. The historian's name was Verith, and she was Thalassian, and she had spent 7 years writing the paper that she was now, finally, preparing to submit for publication. It was titled, simply, The Misreading, and it was about humanity. She had started it as an academic exercise, a study of how different Concord species had interpreted human behavior since first contact. 2 centuries earlier. She had expected to find the usual mix of misunderstandings, cultural biases, and information gaps. What she found instead was something more uncomfortable. A pattern. Consistent, across species, and across generations. Almost every civilization in the Concord had looked at humanity and seen roughly the same thing. A species that was capable and intelligent, and occasionally frustrating, but fundamentally manageable. Moderate, safe to underestimate in certain specific ways. What no one had properly understood, Verath concluded, was that human moderation was a choice. It was something they were doing deliberately, from a position of strength, not something they were doing because it was the only option available to them. The patience was real, but it had limits, and those limits were not abstract, they were specific, and they were non-negotiable, and the humans had, on many occasions over 2 centuries, stated them clearly. The galaxy had not listened. Or rather, it had listened in the way one listens to a legal disclaimer, hearing the words, processing them as formality, not truly believing they would ever matter. She wrote in the paper's final section, "What Calum IV taught the galaxy was not that humanity was dangerous. Every species with a sufficient military is dangerous. What it taught us was that humanity meant what it said. This is rarer than it sounds. Most diplomatic communication is performance signals designed to shape the behavior of others while preserving options for oneself. Humanity's warnings were not performance. They were information. We chose not to treat them as such. The cost of that choice was paid by 40,000 people who had nothing to do with the decision." She submitted the paper on a quiet afternoon. It was published 6 weeks later. Within a month, it had been read by more people in more species than any academic work she had ever produced. She received messages from researchers, diplomats, military analysts, and ordinary citizens across the Concord. Most of them said, in different words, the same thing. "We knew this. We didn't say it out loud. Thank you for saying it out loud." Admiral Doran had been retired for 4 years when a young officer named Sarah came to visit him. She was new to the Defense Command, sharp, ambitious, full of the particular energy of someone who has just been given real responsibility for the first time. She had read everything she could find about the Vrathi War, and there were questions she wanted to ask from the man who had commanded it. He received her on the porch of his house, in the late afternoon, with tea. He listened to her questions carefully. He answered most of them straightforwardly about logistics, about command decisions, about the things that had worked and the things that hadn't. Then she asked the one she had been saving, "What do you think the war actually taught us?" She said, "Not what it taught the Vrathi or the Concord. Us, humanity. What did we learn about ourselves?" He was quiet for a while, looking out at the garden in front of the porch. The light was getting low, and the shadows from the trees were long. "We learned that we hadn't changed as much as we thought," he said. "We'd been at peace for a long time. 180 years of not fighting. And some people, a lot of people, had started to think that peace had made us different, softer, in a permanent way. That we'd grown out of certain things." He picked up his tea and held it without drinking. "We hadn't. We'd just been choosing not to. There's a big difference." He paused. "I'm not sure if that's a comforting thing to know or a difficult one." Sarah thought about it. "Both, maybe," she said. Dorn looked at her and nodded. "Both," he agreed. The Vrathi child's name was Keth, and he was 11 years old, and his school had brought him and his classmates on a trip to a place he had been told was important. He stood in front of the monument on Calum IV and looked up at the names. There were so many of them, row after row, going further than he could follow with his eyes. He didn't know any of the names. He couldn't read all of them. They were in a human script. He was only just beginning to learn. But he understood what they were. His teacher was a quiet woman named Doss, and she stood beside the class and let them look for a while before speaking. "Who built this?" a student asked. "We did," Doss said. "Why?" Kith asked. Doss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because we had to. Because the people whose names are on this stone needed to exist in the world in some permanent way, even after they were gone. And because we were the ones who took them away, so we were the ones who had to give them this." Keth looked at the names for a long time. He thought about all the people those names had been, people who had eaten meals and had favorite things and known other people who loved them. He thought about how they had all been here and then they hadn't been. He thought about his own government making the decision that had done this. And he felt something complicated and heavy that he didn't yet have the words to name. When the class returned to the transport, he sat at the window and watched the monument until it was too small to see. He kept thinking about it on the long ride home, and the day after, and for many days after that. He carried it with him in the way that certain things stay with you when you're young. Not as a memory exactly, but as a weight, becoming part of the shape of who you are. In the Concord chamber, the new human ambassador was a young woman named Priya. She had been at her post for 6 months. She was soft-spoken and smiled easily, and was liked by nearly everyone who worked near her. A Vrathi observer named Fetch had been assigned to the gallery as part of his government's diplomatic staff. He was young and studious, and took his work seriously. He spent his days watching the chamber proceedings and writing summaries for his superiors. He was good at reading rooms, at noticing the things that weren't said, the tensions under the surface, the weight behind polite language. He watched Ambassador Priya carefully. She was, on the surface, everything a diplomat was supposed to be. Warm, patient, collaborative, careful with words. She listened well. She found common ground. She diffused small conflicts before they became large ones. But now and then, in certain moments, Fetch noticed something in the way she held herself. When a discussion touched on something that seemed to matter in a deeper way, a brief stillness, a precision that appeared for just a second in her eyes before the warmth returned. It was a small thing. Most people in the room would not have noticed it. Fetch noticed it. And every time he did, he thought about the monument on Calum IV, and the trials, and the 91 days of war, and the data chip with the numbers on it, and the Marine who had said we're fighting for Calum IV, as simply as someone stating the weather. He thought about what Vereth's paper had said, about warnings that were information, not performance. He was careful after that to be very